What's the problem? Tell me exactly what's happened.
Someone's murdered him.
What do you mean someone's murdered him? What's happened to you?
He's had his throat slit.
Right.
It doesn't matter how much Jack Frew trusted his friend, or that their relationship had spanned across years, because on a warm spring night in 2010, Jack's friend had hate in his heart and an evil plan that he was determined to put into action, and no amount of reminiscing on days gone by was going to stop him. When Jack entered the woods that day, his fate was sealed. This is the devastating case of Jack Frew, a story of secrets, betrayal and a murder that stunned a nation, leaving a community of mourners asking one question: why? Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if you run on caffeine, true crime and swear words, then you're in the right place and you're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready, because it's time for more true crime. Jack Frew was a lively 16-year-old student at Duncanrig Secondary School. He was the kind of person who seemed to glow with positive energy. He was openly gay and never shy about being himself. A popular kid with a flamboyant, outgoing personality. Friends knew Jack for his love of drama and music. He took part in school theatre productions and would burst into song at a moment's notice. Teachers and classmates alike admired him. In fact, just 2 years earlier, Jack had won a school prize for merit and outstanding endeavour, and he stole the show playing the dame in a school production of Aladdin. Those who knew Jack best described him as clever, witty, cool and fashionable. A teenager full of creativity and humour beyond his years. His bright smile could light up any room, and he had a knack for befriending just about anyone. At home, Jack had a loving, supportive family. He was the son of Robert and Lorraine Frew, and they doted on their happy, loving, vibrant boy, who they said brought fun and laughter to every situation. With loyal friends, a close-knit family and a world of opportunities ahead of him, Jack truly had the world at his fingertips. And as someone who was also known for being open, kind and accepting, it made it all the more tragic that someone he trusted betrayed him. It was a mild spring evening in the quiet town of East Kilbride, Scotland. It was May 6, 2010, election night in the UK, and while the country's attention was on the changing political landscape, 16-year-old Jack Frew set out for what he thought would be a quick chat with a friend. Jack was jovial and happy as he embarked on his journey, enjoying the warm air and the spring weather. But that night, in a secluded patch of woods by his school, Jack's life was about to come to a brutal, premature end. Jack headed to a woodland area near Duncanrig Secondary School, not far from a quiet cycle path in the Mossnuke area of East Kilbride. He was meeting a fellow student and classmate there as they had some things to discuss. What Jack didn't know was that Craig Roy, the young man he was about to meet, had a chilling, ulterior motive. Craig Roy, the person Jack went to meet that night, was not a stranger. In fact, he was one of Jack's classmates at school. The two teens weren't best friends, but they moved in the same social circles and had hung out multiple times before. In fact, unbeknown to most, Jack and Craig shared a secret history that would later come to light. A few months earlier, the two boys had engaged in a brief sexual encounter in a school bathroom, a moment of curiosity and intimacy that had left Craig racked with guilt. This was because Craig Roy had a steady boyfriend, a young man named Christopher Hanna, and cheating on him even just the once filled Craig with panic. Since that indiscretion, Craig said he felt trapped between fear and shame. He claimed that by the spring of 2010, the normally reserved 17-year-old was a bundle of nerves, terrified that Jack might spill their secret. On the surface, Craig Roy gave no indication of this inner turmoil. He was a good student in his final year of school, with no history of trouble and not so much as a single prior scrape with the law. Those around him knew Craig as an ordinary teenager, perhaps a bit quiet, who had been dating his boyfriend for a long time. It was hard to imagine him involved in any kind of violence. But underneath that normal exterior, Craig was growing increasingly desperate. He claimed Jack had been pestering him after their encounter and threatening to tell Craig's boyfriend unless Craig gave in to further sexual favours. Whether this was true or a distortion of reality existing in only Craig's mind, we will never know. Jack isn't alive to tell his side of the story. What we do know is that by early May, Craig Roy felt he had to act, and he somehow convinced himself that confronting Jack alone might resolve the situation. So, when Jack agreed to meet up on the evening of May 6th, Craig came prepared. In the pocket of his jacket, he had a large kitchen knife. In Craig's mind, this wasn't going to be just a friendly chat. It was going to be a reckoning. The pair met at the entrance of the wooded area adjacent to Wellesley Crescent and Mossnook Road, and, with the knife weighing heavy in his pocket, Roy led Jack into the trees under the pretence of talking things out. Once the pair were secluded among the trees, the tension between them snapped and a confrontation took place. Perhaps Jack laughed off Craig's threats, or perhaps he grew frightened when he saw the glint of the knife. We may never know. Craig would later allege that Jack made a provocative move, seeing Jack exposed himself and taunted him. But these claims came solely from Craig and were never corroborated. What we do know is that in that instant, something in Craig Roy snapped. The fear, shame and anger boiling inside him turned into violent action. He lunged at Jack with the kitchen knife, and a horrific frenzy of violence unfolded. In the darkening woods, Craig began stabbing Jack over and over without mercy. Once, twice, 10 times, 20 times, he slashed and stabbed with such ferocity that Jack's throat was cut wide open. Jack screamed and tried to fend off the blows, but he stood no chance. The knife plunged into Jack's chest repeatedly, puncturing his lungs and even slicing into his ribs. The quiet evening air was shattered by the struggle, the sound of metal tearing into flesh, and Jack's cries of pain. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. Jack collapsed onto the ground, his clothes soaked in blood, gasping for breath through a severed windpipe. The once lively boy who had willingly walked into the woods was now mortally wounded, his lifeblood pouring out onto the forest floor. For a moment, silence settled over the scene, broken only by the rustling of grass and leaves underfoot and Craig's own panicked breathing. In those critical seconds, Jack Frew lay dying at Craig's feet. Any decent person's instinct would be to call for help, to try to save the friend he had just hurt. But Craig Roy did something utterly incomprehensible. Instead of dialing an ambulance, he pulled out his mobile phone and called his boyfriend. He babbled for help, not for Jack, but for himself. In a chilling display of self-preservation, Craig sought comfort for his own shock and injuries, a few cuts he sustained himself during the attack, while ignoring the dying boy at his feet. There was no call to 999, no attempt to stem Jack's bleeding. Craig simply turned and walked away, leaving Jack alone as he spoke with his boyfriend on the phone. Not long after, between 6:30 and 6:45 p.m, Jack's bloodied body was discovered near the cycle path. The first people on the scene were met with a sight of pure horror. A young boy lying on the ground, covered in blood, barely recognisable and utterly still. As they tried desperately to come to terms with such an horrific scene, they called 999 to report what they had found.
What's this ambulance? What's the address of emergency?
There isn't an address. It's a bicycle path in where? Down Lick Road, there's a cycle path.
What's the name of the road?
Lick where the old stables used to be.
Lick Road, can you spell that road to me?
I can't. Lick Lick.
Right. Is there any shops or businesses, anything along that road?
Anywhere near it. Oh.
Right. What's the problem? Tell me exactly what's happened.
Someone's murdered him.
What do you mean someone's murdered him? What's happened to you?
He's had his throat slit.
Right. Just stay on the line, okay, so I get some details. We're arranging help for you just now, okay? Listen, are you still within the woods just now?
At the same time, Christopher Hanna, the partner of Craig Roy, who had run to be with his boyfriend while still on the phone, had arrived at the edge of the woods and found Craig standing there, his hands and body covered in blood and a knife still in his hand. After finding the area where Jack Frew lay, he approached him and saw that Jack was in a serious condition. He even checked for a pulse and any signs of life, but after realising there was none, he decided to call for an ambulance, telling call handlers that he believed Jack was dead and that someone has murdered him. "My boyfriend did it." Paramedics arrived within minutes and desperately tried to revive Jack, but it was far too late. His injuries were catastrophic. Jack Frew, who just hours earlier had been laughing with friends at school, was now dead. News of the murder spread quickly through East Kilbride, and shockwaves rippled through the community. It wasn't just that a teenager had been killed in their quiet town. It was who had done it and why that made it all the more unbelievable. When they realised that Jack's own school friend, Craig Roy, had been arrested for the murder, the community's grief was mixed with confusion and disbelief. Police immediately began their investigation into the murder and Craig's role in the night's events. After all, he himself had admitted to others what happened. By May 10th, 2010, just 4 days after Jack's death, Craig Roy was formally charged with Jack's murder. The unthinkable reality set in. A 17-year-old honour student had brutally slain a 16-year-old classmate. At Duncan Riggs Secondary School, teachers and students struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Classes were cancelled for the senior pupils so that young people could begin to process their grief, and counsellors were brought in to help students cope with the trauma of losing a friend in such a violent way. Meanwhile, tributes to Jack Frew poured in from all corners. Facebook memorial groups quickly swelled with thousands of members sharing memories and condolences. Jack's friends remembered the boy who was happy, loving, vibrant, someone who could brighten any room with a joke or a smile. Even people who had never met Jack were moved by the tragedy. Prominent Scottish TV personalities Justin Ryan and Colin McAllister publicly mourned the loss of this young life, writing that Scotland had been robbed of someone special, someone unique, and someone who should still be here. Jack's distraught parents, Lorraine and Robert Frew, retreated from the public eye in the immediate aftermath, requesting privacy to grieve. They had lost their only son in the most horrific way imaginable. In Jack's honour, his schoolmates began planning an acoustic music concert dubbed Frew Fest, as well as a beach party to celebrate what would have been Jack's 17th birthday that July. Even in their grief, the community was determined to remember Jack not for how he died, but for how he lived. For nearly 2 years, Jack's family and friends waited for justice. Finally, in early 2012, Craig Roy stood trial for Jack's murder at the High Court in Glasgow. He was now 19 years old, appearing in the dock in a smart suit and tie, a far cry from the panicked teen in the woods that night. Over the course of a 3-week trial, a jury of 9 women and 5 men heard harrowing testimony about what happened in that woodland. Craig Roy, having already admitted that he stabbed Jack, tried to avoid a murder conviction. His defence team even offered a guilty plea to culpable homicide, the Scottish legal term akin to manslaughter, claiming his responsibility was diminished by a personality disorder. But prosecutors rejected this, determined to show that Jack's killing was not an impulsive loss of control. It was a cold-blooded, premeditated act. In the courtroom, Craig Roy took the stand and gave his version of events. His voice shaking, he claimed that on the night in May 2010, he brought the knife only to scare Jack into backing off. He insisted he never intended to use it. According to Craig, as the two walked into the woods, Jack supposedly propositioned him and even exposed himself, taunting Craig about their past tryst. Craig said that at that moment he felt like a monster and lost control. He recalled pulling out the knife, and then, in his telling, the next thing he remembered was standing over Jack's bloodied body. It was a dramatic story, casting himself as someone pushed past his breaking point by Jack's alleged behaviour. He painted Jack as a predator, calling him a sex pest who had been blackmailing him for sexual favours. Craig claimed that ever since a brief sexual encounter in a school bathroom months earlier, Jack had threatened to tell Craig's boyfriend that Craig had cheated, unless Craig gave in to his demands. This, Craig said, was the reason he was desperate and terrified of Jack. But as sensational as Craig Roy's allegations were, they rested on nothing but his own words. There were no witnesses to Jack ever blackmailing or coercing Craig. No evidence at all that Jack was the violent instigator Craig tried to portray him as. In fact, friends of Jack testified to the opposite. Jack was a lively, warm-hearted teen, perhaps flirtatious and outgoing in nature, but not the kind of person to threaten or hurt someone. The prosecution argued that Craig's story was a self-serving tale concocted to deflect blame. They reminded the jury of the stark facts. Craig had armed himself with a knife before meeting Jack and carried out a violent, sustained and murderous attack on the young boy. Jack Frew died, they emphasised, because Craig Roy made a choice to carry a knife and had no hesitation in using it repeatedly on his classmate. This was not an accident or a momentary lapse, it was murder, plain and simple. After weeks of testimony, it took the jury less than 2 hours of deliberation to see through Craig's story. In February 2012, they returned a unanimous verdict. Craig Roy was found guilty of Jack Frew's murder. As the verdict was read aloud in the hushed courtroom, emotion burst forth amongst those who loved Jack. His family and friends, who had sat through the painful trial, embraced each other and sobbed with relief. Justice had been done for Jack. Craig himself stood pale and silent, his head bowed low and avoiding eye contact with his family as officers prepared to escort him to a cell. In that moment, the young man who had brutally taken a life had to finally face the consequences of what he had done. In a statement after the verdict, Jack's family welcomed the outcome. They had endured hearing their son's name dragged through the mud by his killer, and they responded with both sorrow and indignation. The verdict could only have been murder, because that's what it was. Cold, calculating and planned, the Frew family declared. They condemned the wicked words and lies with which Craig had tried to tarnish Jack's reputation during the trial. Not only had Craig snatched away Jack's life, they said, but in doing so, he had attempted to hurt Jack's good name. The family took comfort, however, in knowing that those who truly knew Jack remembered the wonderful person he really was. Nothing Craig said could take that truth away. A few weeks later, on March 1st, 2012, Craig Roy returned to the court for sentencing. This time, there were no more theatrics or excuses, just the final judgment for his crime. High Court Judge Lord Doherty addressed the now convicted killer, his words stern, describing the murder in stark terms, calling it a brutal, sustained and merciless attack that left Jack dead and mutilated. Craig Roy, he noted, had chosen to carry a weapon to that meeting and then chose to use it in a prolonged, vicious way. For this, the judge handed down the sentence of life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. That means Craig Roy will be almost middle-aged before he can even be considered for parole. For Jack Frew's family, no sentence could truly make up for their loss, but there was some solace in seeing justice served. Outside the court, they described the punishment as appropriate for what Craig had done. Jack's parents later spoke of their son not just as a victim, but as a bright light that had been cruelly extinguished. Jack was a happy, loving, vibrant boy who loved life and brought fun and laughter to every situation, this said in a heart-rending statement. He had the whole world at his fingertips, with a promising future ahead, and he would have made the most of every minute. Those words paint a picture of what was lost on that terrible night. An upbeat young man who should have had decades of adventures and achievements ahead of him, taken in an act of senseless violence. In the aftermath of the case, many in Scotland were left asking why. Why did a petty personal conflict between two teenagers escalate to such a horrific extent? Why did Craig Roy feel that killing Jack was his only option? These are questions that may never have satisfying answers. The tragedy of Jack Frew's murder lies in its utter senselessness, a moment of rage and fear that destroyed one life and derailed another. It serves as a grim reminder of the devastating consequences that can follow when someone chooses to carry and use a knife. In this case, one young man's panic and guilt turned into lethal brutality, and countless lives were shattered in the process. At this point, I just wanted to offer my condolences to the family and friends of Jack Frew. May Jack rest in peace. Now, if you took anything from this video, you might also like to watch the video on screen now, where I talk about some of the most evil mothers sentenced for the murder of their children across the UK. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, when it'll once again be time for more true crime.